Warning! The following video contains massive spoilers for Xenoblade Chronicles 2 Story Mode and potential spoilers for the first and second game, that being Xenoblade Chronicles and Xenoblade Chronicles X. While yes, this is mainly a video talking about the DLC Torna the Golden Country, I do have to talk about specific story points that are part of the discussion, so you have been warned. For those of you that don't know, I've been doing a Let's Play of Xenoblade Chronicles 2's New Game Plus mode. It's a bit not traditional in that I've been doing live stream versions of it over on Twitch, and then I'll upload condensed versions of it onto YouTube as episodes. Xenoblade Chronicles 2 is probably one of my favorite Switch games, borderline one of my favorite games in general, and it's definitely my favorite game from the Xenoblade Chronicles series. Xenoblade Chronicles X, and Xenoblade Chronicles 2 being the games in that series. Xenoblade Chronicles 2, I would say, is a great entry point for people who want to experience the series, because the first game had a lot of nuances that made it unique. The combat system was unique, the whole affinity system, which was interacting with your party member and the world around you. There was a whole reputation you could build, and it was great. And Xenoblade Chronicles 2 has most of that, but it's a kind of dumbed-down version, which make it a lot more friendly to people who want to get into the series. Also, there's no direct connection to the game, the first game, especially not the second game, so you can jump in really at any point, but I personally recommend jumping in with Xenoblade Chronicles 2. Xenoblade Chronicles 1's nuances don't necessarily make it a bad game, but it's a very hard and it's not very friendly to people who want to experience the series. There's a lot to go on, especially if you want to 100% it. I'm kind of stumbling over my words, so if you want to learn more about Xenoblade Chronicles 1, I would either play it yourself, which I recommend doing. You should absolutely play it. It's a fantastic game. But if you're getting into the series, I recommend Xenoblade Chronicles 2. That's what I was saying. So either play it yourself, or you could go check out a Let's Play. I highly recommend Chugga Conroy's, because he goes over everything in great detail. It is a 100% Let's Play. He talks about stuff that happened during development, and he's all around just a fantastic commentator. At launch, Xenoblade Chronicles 2 came out with a Season Pass or Expansion Pass, whatever you want to call it, and it promised to release new content over the course of the following year. The game came out in, I think, November of 2017, and it promised content until October of 2018. This content ranged anywhere from new quests, new blades, which is the game's weapon/character system, a more refined New Game Plus, which actually wasn't added until later on in the game's lifetime. Xenoblade Chronicles 2 has the benefit of being on the Switch, which allows it to roll out updates, so they could refine the New Game Plus and make it better. One of the things they added into Xenoblade Chronicles 2's New Game Plus was the ability to level down your characters to add an increase of challenge, and so that you wouldn't just be bowling through the game. It would give you a chance to enjoy it a second time. They also added some other new things to New Game Plus, like the ability to get new blades within New Game Plus that were exclusive to New Game Plus. A whole host of things were added to New Game Plus, making it overall more refined experience. One of the other things that was promised was a campaign add-on. Now, when I heard, or I guess rather read, campaign add-on, my mind immediately went to Skyrim, Borderlands, and Fallout. Those three games are pretty famous for having pretty expansive and really fun campaign DLC. Borderlands has, I think, across its three games, it has 9, maybe more campaigns. I think probably more, because Borderlands 2 got quite a bit. So hearing all of that, and knowing what I know about games, the bar was set kind of high. But because of all the promised content, I had some money left over in my PayPal at the time, and I figured, why not? So I bought the Season Pass. At E3 2018, we finally heard about the campaign DLC, Torna the Golden Country. In the main story, they reference the events of 500 years ago that happened in Torna quite a bit, through the use of flashbacks and cutscenes. Characters will even talk about it, and I actually think it makes a lot of sense for the DLC campaign to be about Torna, because of this and some other reasons which I'll get into. So let's talk about why this makes sense. Unlike Borderlands, where there's always going to be another vault to find, or in Skyrim, where the plot points of the DLC are kind of fluid and they can happen at any point, Xenoblade Chronicles 2 has a very concrete ending. Rex saves the world, and that's it. There's really no conceivable reason for him to continue adventuring. In Borderlands, you're a mercenary. It makes sense that you'd keep looking for jobs that bring you in money. In Skyrim, you're groomed to be an adventurer from the beginning, and the game never even presents itself with an actual ending. But like I said, there's no solid reason for Rex to continue his adventure. You saved the world. You saved the Titans. You literally brought the world together. And Pyra and Mithra have their own personality. There's no real reason for another campaign to happen after all of that. To go along with the point that there's no conceivable reason for an after-campaign DLC for Xenoblade 2, this game follows the trope that a lot of JRPGs do, and that there's no playable canonical universe where you've beaten the final boss. Sure, there's a cutscene where you see everyone's happy, but after that cutscene ends, you're taken back to right before you beat the final boss. And sure, there are things that technically unlock after you've beaten it, because you as the player know, and the game recognizes that you've beaten it in the form of, you know, some new enemies and some new items and maybe even some new quests. But Malos is still in the final area waiting for you to challenge him. Pirate and Mithra are still one person. The Titans are still separated. So all of this being the case, it actually makes a lot of sense for the campaign DLC to be set before Xenoblade Chronicles 2 takes place. And because we have all of these world-building elements of Torna and what happened 500 years ago, it makes it even better case for it. We know that the events of 500 years ago have to end with the beginning of Xenoblade Chronicles 2. Not directly end with the beginning, but the events of 500 years ago effectively lead up to the beginning of Xenoblade 2, so we know how that has to end. Malos destroys Torna, Jin eats Laura's heart, Amalthus is a power-hungry, I guess human? That's what Rex calls him, but I don't want to say God, because he's really not, but he is. But we get glimpses of what the world was like 500 years ago. We get glimpses of what these characters were like and what happened. So you put together those glimpses with how it doesn't really make sense for there to be an after campaign, and of course you include fan service. All of these things kind of make a perfect recipe as to why it absolutely makes sense, and it, in some ways, might even be super important that the campaign DLC is a prequel. Torna the Golden Country feels a lot like Borderlands the pre-sequel, in that it started out as something that was a simple add-on, but there was a desire to flesh out and make things, you know, more their own and give the game its own identity. Torna the Golden Country is technically getting released as a standalone game. Again, this is one of the reasons why I say it's like Borderlands the pre-sequel, in that if they didn't release it as a standalone game, in order to experience it, you'd have to buy Xenoblade Chronicles 2, which is $60, then you have to buy the expansion pass, or just buy that content pack. They wanted people to experience this so much that they said, screw all that. If you bought the expansion pass, you'll get it for free, but we want people to experience this game, so we'll just release it standalone. It's not just a simple add-on. There are fundamental changes to how the game works that give it its own identity, and I'd like to talk about some of those right now. Before we do, I want to talk a bit more about the pre-sequel. Some people think that it's essentially glorified DLC for Borderlands 2, and to some extent, I agree. Overall, I don't. I think that the pre-sequel is a phenomenal game on its own, and it's a lot shorter than Borderlands 2, and it's a lot more manageable to complete. But that's what they're doing with Torna the Golden Country is a lot smarter. Like I said, they want people to experience this game, but they don't want people to have to essentially pay $100 to play it. So, what do? They release it as its own standalone game, and they give it to people who bought the game and the expansion pass for free. That's smart. It's a smart marketing move, in my opinion. So anyway, let's go over these changes and look at it and see what we know, and let's also just talk about Torna in general. Right away, you can notice some UI changes, the blade selection UI being the most eye-catching one, so we'll go ahead and start there. It seems to indicate that drivers can have elements. Laura here has a fire element, and recall from Jin's stories, and the game in general, that Laura was his driver. It also looks like that you'll be able to switch between driver and blade for combat, adding, again, more nuance, but in a way that makes the game more fun and interactive. The more familiar elements of the UI, like enemy health bars, driver combo indicators, all have gotten a very subtle overhaul, but as a result, it all looks nicer in my opinion. In the base game, all of these elements don't necessarily look bad, but they do kind of look and feel disjointed, and it looks like that problem is solved here. It all looks more uniform, for lack of a better word. I want to talk about switching between driver and blade again for a second. If you watch the footage, you'll notice that switching inflicted topple on the enemy after Laura had inflicted break. In the gameplay, they talk about this as being something called a switch art. So whenever you switch from driver to blade, it's kind of almost like a talent art type thing. It's a fourth art, is really what it is. Next up here on the pause menu, we can notice some changes made to the character screen. Most things look and function the same from what we've seen so far, but the biggest change is actually in equipment. In the base game, you could not change your weapon because, well, you fought using blade weapons. But here, since the combat system was enhanced, it does make sense that we see the return of equipable weapons for the driver. And it also looks like that these weapons will influence what element the driver has. Another quick change, addition, whatever you want to call it, seems to be that they're bringing back the side character party system. This was in the first game. The side characters can't actually fight, and they don't really have any bearing on anything except the story. They don't do anything in the overworld. You can't even really see them in the overworld. But it kind of serves as a reminder to what you're doing, and while it's not necessarily needed, it's still neat nonetheless. Next up, we have a new mechanic, campsites. We have chatting, we have crafting, and we have rest. I imagine chatting will be a way to increase affinity between party members and will also serve as a way to really get to know characters, character development. Crafting sounds pretty self-explanatory. It looks like you can make things if you have the right materials, and this also looks to be character dependent. And I imagine resting will be kind of like inns were in the base game, where you can level up with your bonus experience, maybe even level down, and possibly change the cloud seed tide. Looks like field skills return, and in some of the fights you may be able to notice that enemies are dropping ox cores that don't need to be crafted. This is part of the change to make the game more streamlined, so this makes me wonder what other tedious things may have changed. I think this is a fantastic idea, and I can't wait to see what other things that they may have streamlined. If we look here at the first boss fight, it looks like the music is still the same track as the base game, you know, that's good. I mean, at least I think so. And now let's take a look at whatever this thing is, Gargoyle. Recall that Mithra had an artifice named Siren, and Pyra had an artifice named Ophion. In my Xenoblade 2 Let's Play, I've talked about how it's weird that Malos never had his own artifice. Perhaps that's what Gargoyle is. Oh, and since we're here, fan service, it's Adam and Mithra. We finally get to see Adam's face, so yay. The boss fight shows another change too. Driver fights, more specifically. That is, fighting drivers, rather. It's different. Instead of just, killing the driver and the blade goes down, you now have to kill each character, driver, and blade separately, since they are, in fact, separate entities. Speaking of combat changes, it is at this point that we'll get to go over another UI change, and subsequently, the first big change in how combat works. This is because A, we get a new party member, and B, we get a new blade. It looks like pressing left on the D-pad will switch your blade. In this case, it switches from Jin to Haze. But this other new icon is for talent arts, which are returning from the first Xenoblade Chronicles. For those of you that don't know, talent arts were a special skill that would charge over time and were stronger than your regular arts. Shulk's talent art was the Monado, just to put it in perspective. So whereas in Xenoblade 2, the base game, outside of battle you'd use ZL to change blades, and in combat you'd press a button on the D-pad that corresponded to an equipped blade, it looks like in Torna the Golden Country, everything will be on the D-pad both in the field and in combat. This does raise an interesting question though. They never actually showed how blade switching would work in combat in the Treehouse demonstration, and we haven't even seen any proper gameplay footage since then. So what does this mean? I actually have a theory. If we look back at the trailer, we can actually get a glimpse of other potential party members like Morag and Niall's ancestor Hugo, who wields Bridget and Aegeon. Remember this number 2. This, in tandem with the fact that we never saw anyone in Torna with more than 2 blades, leads me to believe we'll only ever be allowed to have 2 equipped at one time. This could also potentially mean that we won't be able to awaken core crystals that aren't story related. No special unique blades that aren't story related, and no common blades. Remember, they changed the combat system so that blades and drivers could fight semi-independently. So that means that if every driver gets 2 blades, that's 3 potential fighters, 3 weapons, whatever you want to call it. In Xenoblade Chronicles 2, you had 3 blades to swap from, so at least thematically, the 2 combat systems will be mirrored. 3 fighters, 3 weapons, whatever you want to call it. So thinking about that, it kind of makes sense that only 2 blades would be equipped at one time. In addition to your driver, of course. I lastly want to touch on why I said I think that there will be no core crystal awakenings unless they're story or supposed to be canon. No matter how much paint or how much nuance this game gets, right? New coat of paint is what I mean. At its heart, it's really just an add-on campaign. Now, I have no doubt in my mind that it's going to be long enough and filled with enough nuance of its own that it'll realistically be its own game. But remember, it was designed initially as DLC. There have been a good amount of changes to the game's combat and fundamentals of the game in general that, adding onto that, having to wake up 40 plus new uncommon blades and an infinite amount of new common blades, if everything's supposed to be streamlined, to me that kind of feels like it would slow the pacing down. Now again, because this is also supposed to be its own game, I could be completely wrong. They could have put like 20 brand new unique blades in there, but I really don't think that they'll do that, especially when we've essentially done it already. And that's the next point I want to hit on is, what about Borderlands? What about Skyrim? Those DLC campaigns add entirely new weapons, and one of them even added a whole new mechanic. That's right, that's absolutely correct. But keep in mind, Borderlands add-ons are strict add-ons, is that they add on to the base campaign. They're not prequels in any way. They take place after the main campaign, and they're meant to be, the new weapons and the new campaigns are meant to take place after you've completed and on top of an existing character. That means a new assault rifle you find will work on a character that you already have at a very high level. Torna the Golden Country doesn't look like it's going to carry any data from the base game. So, in that regard, it doesn't make sense to add a whole new bunch of randomized cores and blades that you can awaken. Think about how it's presented, is essentially the argument I'm trying to make there, if that makes sense. Also, remember that the only time that we ever saw common blades was in the cutscene where Laura dies. And I don't think that was to illustrate that there would be common blades back then. I think it was really to illustrate the devastation of drivers just dying. It feels like Torna the Golden Country is trying to hybridize what it means to play Xenoblade Chronicles 2 and Xenoblade Chronicles 1, while still at its heart being the second game. And I think this is actually a great idea. They mentioned that this game in particular would be a great entry point into the series, and I have to say, I think I agree. It feels like enough of the first game and the second game that you could play that, and really play either one after that, but it would probably honestly be smarter to play Xenoblade Chronicles 2 after playing Torna the Golden Country. All the changes are welcome changes, and just in general, I'm very excited for Torna the Golden Country. So that's going to end today's video, today's mission. Your next mission, should you choose to accept it, just leave a like and a comment. Talk about any of the things I talked about. Let me know if you agree, disagree. I'd love to get into a discussion in the comments. But with all that being said, I'm going to get up out of here. Peace.